Welcome to Madison, Chuck, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Well, am I on? Do I need to, oh, there we go. I am thrilled to be with you here at the peak of your circadian attention, and hopefully I'll be able to keep it. Oh, beautiful. There's my countdown clock. Penny's got that good. I sometimes lose track of myself. So, science strives for objectivity, but every scientist has a personal story, a narrative of how they come to feel the way they do about the world, think the way they do about the world. And I decided, perhaps somewhat at my own risk this morning, to share some of that with you folks. I've never given this kind of talk before, but this seemed like an appropriate venue to try something like that. So for me, how did I come to do the work I do? In many ways, it started here. I grew up in a small, impoverished farming community in the Central Valley of California, routinely one of the poorest, most broken down areas of the United States. Very typically American in many ways. There's only one thing in this picture that's not very typical. Does anybody see anything unusual? What about the sky? There's something just to the right. It's like a ghost, isn't it, right? So my childhood in this highly polluted, it's also the most polluted place in the United States, the air is really horrible, was haunted by these ghosts that existed out on the horizon. And sometimes, when the weather cleared, it looked like this. And so I grew up with this dichotomy between the landscape of this valley, most of which looks something like this, and this landscape about 30, 40 miles away. Trying to figure out how could two such disparate things exist in the same world? How do they stand in relationship to each other? And they stand, in fact, in a very, very tight, they used to be very tight biological relationship with each other. This was what really started me with this idea of how do we understand ways to unify things that seem to be opposites in sort of conflict with each other. And here, actually, there's a great quote by the great old man of these mountains who grew up, of course, in Wisconsin, a native son, John Muir, who said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. That, if I were to just say thank you, nice to talk to you folks, I'm going to sit down now, that's the essence of this talk. I want to suggest to you that when we think about consciousness, not in any mystical sense, because I'm not of a mystical bent in any particular way, but actually, I think in a scientific sense, this looking at consciousness in this way opens up some really interesting potential, both in terms of theoretical, but as I hope to show you, some practical ways of doing things you wouldn't do if you didn't have this sort of idea. Now, it's interesting because it flies in the face, this idea of everything being connected to everything. I mean, it sounds kind of mystical and cool and stuff, but it flies in the face of how we tend to experience ourselves on a day-to-day world. I mean, every single one of us thus far has probably had this sense that there's an environment out there. It's you guys, it's the trees, it's the building, it's the coffee, and then us, the sort of center of the universe here, the all-important center. And if we break it down further, we might say, well, we know, as I say, that there's a world out there, and we're such social creatures that the big element is humans in the world. We know that there's these crazy interactions. And then we know we got a brain, and some of us think we have a mind, some of us don't, right? Some of us think that consciousness is just something that comes out of the brain, and the mind is like exhaust out the back of a car. Other people think that the brain is just a donkey that some immaterial mind rides. Then there's these ideas of emergence, which sound good, but they're sort of, really when you think about them critically, it's a little bit difficult to make sense of them. And then we know that there's something that links the outside to the inside, and of course those are our senses. And what I want to suggest is that although this view is how we mostly wander around in the world to one degree or other, I've become increasingly convinced that it's inadequate and probably not as close to what actually exists in the world as something that we might call the principle of embodiment. Now, this is not my idea by any means. One of the great founders of this field, Francisco Varela, right, who had a long connection with Richie Davidson and things here in Madison, wrote this. If you haven't read this book, it's a really prescient, beautiful book about how an embodied enactive cognition approach to consciousness lines up very nicely with certain aspects of Prasangika Buddhism. Very interesting. But there's a lot that has evolved. This is a very rapidly evolving field in cognitive neuroscience. These are all things: soft robotics, embodied cognition, morphological computation. We could spend the entire talk, quite interestingly, and I'm not an expert in all the niceties of this, but showing how this idea has given rise to amazing advances in making artificial systems that are more able to cope with the world than systems that are more like a basic computer that has to sort of run an algorithm, figure everything out, and then do something, right? The idea here behind all these is summed up in this really beautiful paper called Embodiment is Not What You Think. I'm just going to read you a couple of quotes from it. So, embodiment is the surprisingly radical hypothesis that the brain is not the sole cognitive resource we have available to solve problems. If you wanted to get a little bit woo-woo, we could say it's not the sole source, perhaps, of consciousness. Our bodies and their perceptually guided motion through the world do much of the work required to achieve our goals, replacing the need for complex internal mental representations. So the idea here, and then finally, is that our behavior emerges from the real-time interplay of task-specific resources distributed across the brain, body, and the environment, coupled together via our perceptual systems. It's a little bit like comparing a typical computer program. It runs all these algorithms and then does an output. That works very, very well for things like games of chess where all the parameters are locked in. But what this position suggests is that to be as cognitively complex as any animal is, and certainly as we are, requires that we offload and outsource a good deal of who we are onto the environment. That the environment, and various aspects of it, actually hold for us elements that we think of as our own, but that are absolutely essential for how we do things. So, for instance, they've shown that it's very, very difficult for humans to hold things if they wear little metal things here, that much of our ability to do something simple, like grab a cup, has to do with the fact that we are not made of metal, but we have soft tissue, and the compression of the tissue on the cup and its signal to the brain and back actually does a great deal of the work for things like that, for walking. And when these are applied to robotics, it's amazing. You get these machines that can grab things, hold things, move things, do all sorts of things that are very interesting without having to have very complex things going on up in their head, which doesn't mean that we don't have very complex things going up on our head. We all do. But we're my argument is we so overprivilege that we miss out on this really amazing fact that much of what we are is distributed and dispersed and looks something like this. Right? So rather than having the two separate boxes, we can imagine these bidirectional, tridirectional interactions between the larger environment, the social environment, and the brain. And it's this triad that I want to spend the rest of today talking about and showing how if you adopt this triad, it opens up some interesting therapeutic possibilities. A soft version of what I'm talking about would see all these things as important, blah, 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 but consciousness really still as residing in the brain. A more radical interpretation that you don't have to accept to be able to get some of the therapeutic benefits of this perspective, but an idea that fascinates me is that rather, not in a mystical sense, like some sort of fog that pervades the world, but in a very pragmatic sense, in many real ways, consciousness may emerge from these interactions between the brain, the body's sensory systems, and the larger social and physical environment. So what I'd like to do now is go through each of these different things, the world, the social world, and these fascinating sensory linkages, and give you a little story about how I personally came to this idea. Right now, I didn't read a fancy textbook until fairly recently. The genesis of these ideas for me came from some really unusual places, which itself illustrates how the world is really this unexpected, interconnected, surprising place, and how much of who we are derives from our connections with things outside ourselves, right? So if we think about these sensory linkages, for me, it started with this guy. Anybody here know Lobsang Rinpoche? Fascinating fellow, one of the great, great minds in the Tibetan Buddhist world. Keeps a low profile. He's got 2 PhDs, and he's a Tibetan doctor. But he mostly hangs out at UCLA and studies attention. But he and I became big buddies back, about almost 20 years ago now. And we used to spend about 3 or 4 hours every week sitting at the Panda Inn, and he told me all sorts of gossip about everything in the Tibetan world. So I know all sorts of things about Tibetans I'm not supposed to know. But when he wasn't doing that, he was giving me this very eclectic sort of education in some of their basic ideas, and doing it in a way that I have never heard anybody else do before or since. So this one conversation, I literally almost remember it exactly, and so I'm going to read it to you. So Lobsang says, the problem with the mind is that it's so flighty. You're meditating well, all is good, and then a thought comes and hijacks the mind, upsets your emotion, and that's that. This is why sutra methods take so long. He actually said, 3 kalpas. The universe gets destroyed and created 3 times before you can achieve enlightenment purely through sutra methods. Tantra gets around this by using bodily energies and processes to drive the mind into stable emotional states that are far less likely to be affected by your thoughts and your feelings or by events. You want to use these body energies to put the mind into a state of stable, imperturbable bliss that does not depend upon circumstances. You want to use the body to drive the brain into an unrealistic, fixed state of euphoria, because you got to have that to tolerate emptiness. And he showed me this picture of, said that the fast way is a rough way. It was one of their ascetics in a cave, and the guy was like, oh, like this, because he was trying to make it in one lifetime, right? It's the view of, don't ask me, I've never seen it, but apparently the view of emptiness, if achieved too rapidly, can be extremely harrowing. Joy and I were sort of talking about this, right? To which I said, wow, that sounds like mania. And that's what got me started, because I started thinking, I bet if we studied these dudes, we could figure out what bodily processes contribute to mania. To which Lobsang said, yeah, some of those old yogis were pretty crazy, which is true. So Lobsang let me in to 2 really, to me, amazing things, both of which exercised my mind for about 2 years, almost obsessively. One is this. Just read it to you. Many of you will know about this. This is from Alexander David Neal's account. Sometimes a kind of examination concludes the training of the Tumo students. Everybody here know what Tumo is? This crazy heat meditation, right? All right. I had never heard of this. I was like, what are you talking about, Dr. Ropke? Upon a frosty winter night, those who think themselves capable of victoriously enduring the test are led to the shore of a river or a lake. If the streams are frozen in the region, a hole is made in the ice. A moonlit night, wind blowing, chosen, freezing but cold. The neophytes sit naked on the ground, cross-legged. The sheets are dipped in the icy water, and each man wraps himself in the sheets, and he has to dry it on his body. Now, there's a great video of me and this total skeptic doing exactly this on a freezing morning. Anybody can, I hate to say it, but the steam in the sheets is no big deal, but what is a big deal is these guys do it over and over and over again on freezing nights. Now, the winner of this contest is the guy that dries the most sheets. Hey, that makes sense. That sounds like enlightenment to me, right? So so maybe this is just like some little weirdo thing that some freaky Tibetans did. Oh no, if we can invoke, in fact, Tsongkhapa, who's really the founder of the Gelug school. This guy is like the big, heavy dude of traditional Tibetan Buddhism. At least it's the Dalai Lama school. In this tradition, the expression, the inner heat, the foundation stone, is well known because for all the completion stage yogas, this Tumo heat technology is required from the beginning. It's the actual basis upon which everything sits. Why the hell would these complex enlightenment procedures sit on trying to modulate your body temperature and drying sheets, right? That's so crazy. And people have been doing it for so long. I said, there's got to be something here that I just completely misunderstand. And I've got to understand why the hell anybody would do that. I've been doing this for 1,000 years, right? Related to that, Lobsang Ropke let me in on another little thing. He said, well, while we're at it, there's something that's related to this. He said, it has to do with our understanding of the natural states that are closest to enlightenment, all right? So just think for a second. If you were to say, what are the natural states closest to enlightenment? Rapturous union with nature, deep meditative concentration, close communion with others, a sense of flow. You're absorbed in your work and you're feeling that way. Maybe watching the birth of your child, right? I mean, these, right? These sound pretty good. In fact, according to this deep and not very well known medical Tantra, these are the moments in your life when you are closest to enlightenment. Sneezing, yawning, coughing, drooling, farting, taking it down, urinating, vomiting, hunger, thirst, breathing, sleeping, and of course, maybe not such a surprise, orgasm. All these phenomena are rapid beep, beep, flips in autonomic nervous system functioning. They're bodily processes that disrupt the mind for a second, right? They cause an opening in your continual flow of thoughts. But it points again to the fact that these bodily processes can jerk the mind around in ways that are directly relevant to enlightenment. And these guys out there in Tibet with nothing to do but chase enlightenment and drink yak butter, they had thousands of years in long, cold winters to perfect this to beautiful. So these guys are a huge resource that we in the West have not tapped into in this way. But this is how I came to this idea that there was something about sensory signaling pathways that might be directly relevant to manipulating or impacting the function of the brain. Now, what about social stuff? Well, here, I don't need to tell you that humans are, other than ants and stuff, we're like the uber social animals. We live our lives. We are probably the main environmental impact for each other. There's a lot of evidence that we've driven our own evolution through our interactions and stuff. But what's become increasingly clear to me, and I am 100% convinced this is true, is that we don't take the idea of social connectivity far enough or far enough down. That it's like the lady who thought the world, sat on a turtle, and somebody asked her, well, what holds up the turtles? And she said, it's turtles all the way down, right? In the same way, I want to suggest to you that the world has a fractal nature when it comes to these interdependency social relationships, and that in fact, they go very deep, and that if we look at us, these relationships extend down to these key elements with which we interact and of which we're largely in some ways made of, the bacterial world, the world of the very small. And I want to suggest to you that when we think about our families and we think about our social environments, that we really need to be thinking this way. It needs to fade off into the trillions and trillions of microorganisms that abide by, frankly, the same social rules we do. How we treat other people turns out to change our bodies in ways that almost certainly impacts how we treat our microorganisms. And although nobody's quite studied this yet, I'm pretty sure the opposite is true too. So before I say that, is there data for this? Well, there's lots of data. Here's a fascinating study. They looked all around the world and said, over the last 10,000, 15,000 years, what are the factors that have most driven differences in the forms of genes between groups and people? The number one thing is who you have sex with, right? So folks that, racial and ethnic groups, very subtle, but that's a big, that's why some people have one color skin or one color eye. The number two factor that has been most impactful in creating who we are over the last 10,000 years are the bugs. The bugs have driven our evolution more than anything else. And it's not bugs in general, it's the bugs that you live with in your tribe, in your environment, in your locality. This is why people didn't like to travel so much back in the old days. They knew it was lethal to travel. You read travel documents from the 17th, 18th century. People wanted to take the grand tour, but it increased their risk of death. You're more likely to die from a stranger's bugs than you are from your own bugs. Why? Because you've co-evolved with your own bugs. They're part of your family. They're part of this extended network that you take with you. So where the hell did this come from? Well, this is how these things happen. I was minding my own business, and I saw this book, and I said, that sounds kind of interesting. Now, I had slept through infectious disease in medical school, and when I wasn't sleeping, I was trying to date this girl, and so I was in the back writing cute little notes. This is the most boring stuff I've ever heard of in my life. It's ironic that I've become obsessed with it in my old age. This is a really nice book. If you've never read it, it's about antibiotic resistance. But basically, as I read it, I realized that this woman, without quite saying it, was espousing this idea that if we can't figure out how to come to tolerant win-win relationships with the microbial world, we're going to go back to the bad old infectious days. we have to find ways to get along with that world the way we do with each other. And the hero of this book, in many ways, was a gentleman named Graham Rook. And if I had 2 hours, I'd tell you the long and convoluted story about how he and I became big buddies. But we did. I said, oh, someday I'd like to meet that guy. So we've written a lot of papers together because we share this idea that I've just articulated that, in fact, who we are is largely determined by our interaction with the microbial world in which we swim. I want to give you 2 examples of this, okay? This is an animal study. It's actually kind of a nice animal study because we're not going to kill any animals here. But there's 2 different kinds of mice. There's the Balb C nervous Nelly, sees its shadow, has a heart attack, right? You can tell by looking at it, right? Then there's Mr. Super Stud, the NIH Swiss. You see, look at it. You can see for yourself, right? It's all on them, right? The poor little white mouse. This is how long do they stay in the light? They don't like to stay in the light. So he stays like for barely anything and hides in the dark. This dude's hanging out going, hey, what's the problem, man? I can see what I'm doing here. The other is a step-down test where the point is, in every test, these guys are nervous wrecks, and the NIH Swiss are the sort of resilient super studs, right? So one of the most fascinating studies done in the last 10 years probably, and now there's many versions of this. Again, if I had 2 hours, I could tell you about how bone marrow transplants may offer a cure for autism someday. Weird stuff like that. But here what they did was they took the timid mouse, massive antibiotics, completely cleared out its microbiota. So they got rid of those trillions of bacteria in its gut, right? Then they took feces from the super stud mouse, implanted it into the GI tract of the nervous Nelly mouse, and voila, the nervous Nelly mouse turns into a super stud. Now, so you think, wow, I thought that had to do with that mouse's brain. Well, it does. It's not that the brain doesn't matter, but what it's saying is that perhaps much of what we are is actually driven by things that are inside us but not part of us. These bugs are not us. They've got their own agendas that they're pursuing, right? And remarkably, when you do this, you see this behavioral change, and it correlates with increased neurogenesis in the hippocampus. Brain-derived BDNF is this sort of trophic factor that all antidepressants increase. You can do the opposite. Take the fearless mouse, give it the timid feces, and boom, and you see the opposite. You see this drop in hippocampus. Pretty impressive, right? All right. But it's not just animals, so I tried this out last night, just real quickly. I told you the talk was weird, right? What is this? If you were to free associate on this picture, just somebody shout out. What do you think it's about? What am I going to say next? Party? Party what? Party drugs? Vaccine. Vaccine doing what? Making people party? The party vaccine. It's great for like nerds that can't get out. You give them the vaccine and they're out. Yeah, there you go. Now, this is one of the most fascinating human studies. This guy at Indiana State is a really smart dude. So they took a bunch of normal people, and they had them wear a little watch that dinged them about 15 times a day. And every time it dinged them, they had to stop what they were doing, right? What were they doing? Who were they with? Were they being social, et cetera, right? So it's got real-time assessment of their social lives, right? Then they take all those normal people, and they give them a flu shot. And then they repeat the what are you doing, what are you doing, what are you doing 3 days later, and they do it again 2 weeks later. Now, what you can see from the graph on your left is that there's a big, big increase in social behavior 3 days after people get a flu shot. Now, what's interesting about that is that had they actually caught the flu virus instead of the flu shot, that's when they're maximally infectious but not yet sick, right? So we think that social function is just a great thing, right? I don't know why I'm coughing. So glad to see you, right? We're being played like chumps by the virus. The virus, this pathogen manipulation. Many things that we think of as belonging to ourselves are going to be shown to be cooperative, competitive, collaborative interactions between us and these very deep, very small social entities, right? So that's the story of how we sort of came to this realization that there are aspects of sociality, if you take it seriously enough, maybe we can find different ways of talking with the bugs to change how our brain functions. All right, and then finally there's the world itself. And this is completely idiosyncratic, but since I'm telling the personal story here, one part of the world has really got me thinking about something that I think is not perhaps irrelevant, finally, you'll see, to the study of psychedelics. So I come from there, the San Joaquin Valley of Central California, one of the most, as I say, impoverished, least educated, most polluted places, in fact, on the planet. Certainly in the United States, it's the most polluted place. But this brings us to this guy. Now, if I were to ask you about this guy, what would you say? He's a hell of a skateboarder, right? You'd agree with that. I mean, that's pretty impressive. So Matthew Rangel, a colleague of mine, was a semi-professional skateboarder. His parents were both immigrant farm workers. He lived in a little house in downtown Dinuba, where I come from. And one day, on a winter's morning, he walked out of his doorway and he saw those mountains. Now, he'd seen those mountains before, but he saw those mountains for the first time. And he said, how could have I spent my whole life and not seen those mountains? And he decided at then and there that he was going to walk straight out of his house and to the top of the, remember those crazy mountains, right to the top of the mountain. Now, it took him 2.5 years to actually do this because it was not so simple. My family owned a newspaper, the newspaper in this town, for about 100 years, and I used to get it. And my dad had written this story about this little Hispanic kid that was going to walk to the top of the mountains. I was like, oh my God, that's it. I don't know who this kid is, but I've got to meet him. There's somebody else that's as crazy about this stuff as I am. So I actually went and met him on various junctures as he took this walk. He left from here. His house is just right around the corner there. He passed through the fields, and he passed through the foothills. I hooked up with him there. He went up into the lower reaches of Sequoia National Park because he was trying to get to the top of that mountain, which is the Black Cahuilla, which is the mountain you can see from our hometown. This is literally what he did. I managed to haul my out-of-shape butt up over around the backside of those mountains, and I was like half dead. I was laying there. It was raining. And I look up and see the 1,000-foot cliffs of solid granite. I see this little dot. He was serious. When he said he was going to go in a straight line, this dude was going in a straight line. The guy's a human billy goat. He was going straight down the mountain. He had this friend with him, and the guy looked like a ghost, his friend, when he was like, because this guy is a miracle on 2 legs, and this is what he did. But this is not the reason I'm telling you this story. It is kind of interesting. But the reason is because he's an astounding artist. And this became something that in some circles is very well known, called a transect due east. So he produced a series of most remarkable drawings. His work melds maps into the landscape. Here's one, here's one, here's one, and then there's this. And this was for me a revelation. He and I now call this sometimes the body of the mountains, because what it tells you is that this particular ecosystem is like a body. It's got a circulatory system, and it's got this sort of astounding unity. This is the Cahuilla River coming down out of the mountains. So at this juncture, Matthew said, hey, you need to, there's this guy named John Spivey. He grew up in this little dink town next to you. He's a little bit older, and he's written books about this. He's the only other guy that shares this obsession that I know about. He knows everything about the history of this broken down, historyless place from which you come. And so John Spivey and I started this email correspondence, probably 500 pages of emails, never met during this whole time period. But John said something that, and he said it in a way that really stuck with me. So he said, and this is from an email, our minds co-evolved with landscape, and even in nomadic tribes, with exceptions, their patch of ground was not large. Place is an adjunct of mind and part of mind. When a person is in her bonded landscape, she is plugged into it in such a manner that it enlarges and enhances the scope of her mind and her perceptual reach. When away from that familiarity for long, her mind is decreased. When plunged into the bonded landscape, she has an awareness that extends through all the living things within that landscape. There is a niche or a receptor for the landscape in the mind. And when the landscape is missing, there is a void that we try to fill with innumerable things. The landscape is a module of the mind. This, you get emails like this from somebody, right? It's like, well, thanks, yeah, I was watching the football game too, I have many I want to turn this into a book someday. He's written a couple books. I brought 3 copies of his book. So the first 3 people that see me afterwards, I'll actually give you a copy of the book. I would have brought more, but I didn't want to check my bag. Anyway, so there's something very powerful here that I'm not going to talk about except to name it right now, which is, this is a really interesting idea. It suggests, got it, that we may be relying too much on each other in our world because we've separated from these deep connections with landscape which is an evolved factor of how most groups live. Most groups didn't get more than 20, 30 miles from where they were born. They knew the landscape as if it was a living entity. And of course, before there were strip malls and all this development, it tended to be a fairly stable thing. So it's a really interesting question, how much burden we place on each other precisely because we can't offload it onto this more ancient connection. That we've not tested. I'm working on that, but that's not so easy. But it's a clear implication, and it's a testable implication of this idea, but that's just such a beautiful idea. And John gave me this beautiful word called Carencia. Carencia is the deep sense of inner well-being that comes from knowing a particular place on the earth, its daily and seasonal patterns, its fruits and scents, its soils and bird songs. And these are his pictures too, actually. He's a very, very good photographer. So this idea of, this is how I came to be really taken with this idea that larger landscapes, and especially place, setting, may have powerful influences on central nervous system functioning that we might be able to tap into. So, okay, so this brings us to, this is nice, it's interesting, I hope it's interesting, while I still have you on the upside of your circadian swing. But so what, right? There's all sorts of really cool ideas. What you'd like, though, is, an idea not coupled with action will never get any bigger than the brain cell it occupied. I like that saying. I'm a doctor, I'm a psychiatrist, and so, part of my mandate in the world is to try to treat mental illness, and in particular, I'm interested in depression, right? So, the so what is, I want to suggest to you that everything we've been talking about today has direct, actionable potentiality for devising and testing and delivering new treatments for depression. Now, what's interesting about these new treatments for depression is that many of them, it turns out, at least in our hands, evolve out of ancient practices. Because many ancient practices, in my opinion, that people pursued for health and well-being and spiritual attainment and resilience before a battle, actually, without quite articulating it, tapped into that distributed, embodied perspective on things, right? And you'll see how we've tried to rip that old perspective off. We're basically going around, we're like guys going through the junkyard of human, therapeutic history and trying to rehabilitate and fancy up and put a new coat of paint on these ideas that are old and I think very powerful. So, if we're going to think about depression, the first thing to say is that we now know, because the NIH, the National Institute of Health, has said that through research we know that mental disorders are brain disorders. Now, on one level, that means if you got a mental disorder, you're not crazy, right? That's what we're trying to say in a way. But unfortunately, in my opinion, the NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, means this specifically, that the causes for mental disorders are in the brain, and it will be in the brain that we're going to find the cures, right? That's really the idea. And I say no. And this is, we were talking, it's one of the reasons why I've been having a little bit of trouble getting funding lately. I say this. I say that just because the brain is the proximal cause of all mental states does not mean it is the most important, interesting, or therapeutically useful cause for all cases of major depression. All right? So how do we know? I think it's pretty clear that the final common, that little flash of awareness that we all have sitting here, clearly the brain is some sort of final common producer of that. There's some really disturbing evidence, kind of anecdotal, of severed heads still kind of winking and blinking. And so it's pretty clear that up here is where that final thing is happening. So because that's the case, our field, I think, has very naively assumed that that is the spot to focus all your interventions on. Well, so basically it means we want to produce brains that are happy-go-lucky no matter what the rest of the world says, right? That's really what the goal is here. That could be good, that could be bad, but that's what we do. But I don't think it's necessarily the most interesting or productive way of doing things. So I want to show how taking each of these embodied distributed things, the sensory networks, the world, and the the social world and the physical world, how each of those can be mined for potential interventions for depression, or that can cast light on some interesting things like psilocybin research that's going on right now. So let me start with the sensory linkages and talk about a study we've just completed. So I'm a journalist, right? Never having been trained as a scientist, I have to rely on everybody else for things. Whenever it gets complicated, I have to call in my buddies. So I exist in this really fascinating, complex web of people that are really, really cool. So this work I'm about to show you is largely the result of Chris Lowry, who's in Colorado, who is a very close colleague of mine and does basic science work, and Clemens or Walter Janssen, who is actually sitting in the room somewhere. He's the shortest guy in the room. I don't know if you saw him. Did you notice there was a tall man wandering around? And then my very good friend Matthias Mell, I'll tell you what he does, and Megan Robbins. And then, whenever you do something like this, there's the people that actually do it. And I wanted to show you their picture. These three women are actually doing it. Those two are coming to Wisconsin, and I'm working on her. I'm increasingly confident I'm going to convince her to come too, because these guys are just this wonderful team. All right, so what do? Well, we know the brain is not a bag of chemicals, although that's often how antidepressants, they work like the brain's a bag of chemicals. They go everywhere, which is probably partly why they cause side effects. Big interest in psychiatry in trying to localize and stick electrodes into those parts of the brain that we think are most relevant for depression. Big hoopla, greatest thing in the world. Big phase 3 studies just got closed off, don't work. But interesting, right? We like this idea, though, but to us, we think that rather than sticking needles in the head, we might be able to actually use sensory pathways as evolved endogenous deep brain stimulators, right? Why? Because you don't hear tastes, you don't see sounds. These pathways were wired up across millions of years to be truth tellers. When people whose sensory pathways don't work right, as my buddy says, the gene pool is a pool without a lifeguard, right? There's a lot of selective pressure to keep these things in place. So we think that maybe they can be used as deep brain stimulators, and there's two in particular that we're looking at. The immune comes in, you'll see it double dips, because I'm going to talk about it from a social perspective, but I want to talk about temperature. Remember the two more things? Right? You see how things circle around. So I'm obsessed with temperature. Why is there this association between regulation of body temperature and regulation of mood? Well, I'm not the only person that's had this thought, right? So here's an example of an ancient practice. Hundreds of thousands of groups over hundreds of thousands of years have had something like a sweat lodge. They never party. Indigenous people don't party in the sweat lodge. Well, maybe they do, but they're not supposed to, right? It's healing and inspiration and sometimes resiliency for battle. Modern people, these are some sweat lodge warriors here. This sweat lodge isn't going to solve their problems. And then, of course, hot yoga. Anybody in this room addicted to hot yoga and doesn't want to admit it? Good news. There's a reason why you're addicted. We did not start the hyperthermia, cook you, work because of sweat lodges, though. We started it because Chris Lowry, for reasons that I'd love to explain to you, but I don't have time, realized that hyperthermia should work as an antidepressant. So he took mice, he heated them up, and he put them in the standard antidepressant test, same thing they used to discover new antidepressants, and it worked as well as an antidepressant. And the hotter they were, the more of an antidepressant response they got. At that same time, Walter Janssen, who's back here, I told you about, found, and with a buddy of his, rebuilt an old hyperthermia chamber in Switzerland. And we started sticking depressed people in the hyperthermia chamber, and they had this remarkable response. So, why? Well, again, complicated, but we think that there are pathways that run from the skin up to very specific brain areas while dodging other brain areas. And the end result of these pathways, you think about it, what is your body trying to do when you get heated up? Well, you're trying to, it gets activated and you start sweating. You want to keep your body temperature constant, so you activate a thermoregulatory cooling pathway. But it just turns out that those pathways are connected to pathways that run up to key brain areas implicated in depression. Deep brain stimulator idea, right? So here's the University of Arizona, and here is Walter laying in the hyperthermia chamber. And this is the chamber that we've used now for the studies I'm going to show you. Gets up to about 135 degrees inside the room, but it cooks you from inside with infrared light, so it's actually much hotter than that. You think I thought I was going to die, sweat and huff and puff, and it's like running out in the desert in the summertime. we had to devise a placebo condition, right? So to make sure that it wasn't just that you're laying in this box, it's a pretty big deal. Maybe that's what makes you feel better. So we actually built these. Walter went down. He bought these cheapo lights, painted them orange, put in fake fans. Beautiful. We have the people lay for exactly the same amount of time. They see the same kind of lights. They hear the same kind of noise. And 75% of the people in the study I'm about to show you who got the fake treatment thought they got the real treatment. So it really worked, right? It's really interesting. But nonetheless, it worked. People thought they got the real treatment. These are depression scores. And what you're seeing here is time, weeks, up to 6 weeks across the bottom. Down means your depression is getting better, okay? So here's the sham condition. You can see that you get this gradual, slow improvement. So our hypothesis was that the hyperthermia should make people feel better for at least a week, because that's what we saw in Switzerland. So we did it, and kaboom. That is a massive effect size, right? Antidepressants, the pills you take, they don't do anything like this after 1 week. This is about 3 times the size of the average effect of an antidepressant. What we didn't expect was that the effect would stabilize, and that out to 6 weeks, these for those of you that are of a scientific bent, we actually Bonferroni corrected because we didn't have an a priori hypothesis for how long it would last. If you just looked at the raw p-values, it's significant out to 6 weeks. One treatment to something that then puts people in a different state for an extended period of time, which is a radical departure from standard psychiatric ideas that you've got to take a pill every day, like a chronic disease model. Antidepressants take, if you're not getting better in 2 weeks after you start an antidepressant, you don't have a very good chance of getting a long-term response, but they take 6-8 weeks to get a full response. This is now looking at self-reported depressive symptoms. Down means you're getting less depressed over the first week, day 1, 2, 3, and 7. There's the placebo. You see there's a little bit of hopefulness on day 1 that sort of fades out. And again, with the active treatment, you see this very rapid antidepressant response that's already significant by day 3. This is a big effect size difference, right? So it looks like something that's an ancient practice. Get rid of the drumming. If we had the drumming, it would work even better, right? I mean, the spiritual stuff, we're just, what it says is that the reason people drum and do that stuff in a hot place is because this hyperthermia activates pathways. It puts the brain in a certain state that makes them susceptible, open to these powerful experiences, and it also seemed to work as an antidepressant. It's not just antidepressant effects, big effect on quality of life, too, that lasts for at least a few weeks. People feel better about their life. Now, even more interestingly to me, and very unusually, good, I'm right on time, we didn't just ask people how they felt. We actually hooked them up to these sneaky little listening devices. It's called the electronically activated recorder, or the ear, which is the brainchild of this guy, my buddy Matthias Mell. And you can see it started out with a massive thing, it's like computers. Now it's on a little eye-ear device. But what the genius of it is you wear it, you got a little microphone, and for 30 seconds, randomly, silently, every 12 minutes, it turns on. So it would capture probably a minute and a half of this lecture, maybe, something like that. It allows you to see a whole bunch of things about how people spend their lives, right? So you can look at where do they spend their life, public, private, what do they do, TV, music, church, other things, sex. Sometimes people forget to take the darn thing off when they're having sex. It's really crazy. Interactions, dyadic, group, same, opposite sex, topics. Are they talking about, hey, nice weather today? Are they talking, so do you think the cosmic consciousness is, you can look at these things, right? And then what kind of words they use, emotion words, I, me, we, pronouns, all sorts of things you can do. And Matthias Mell has made fascinating discoveries. He discovered that men talk as much as women. Proof. He got hundreds and hundreds of people. The guys blab just as much as the women. That got him in Science, which is like the most prestigious journal in the world, right? It's so shocking that could possibly be true. So we got the bright idea of hooking people up to these little listening devices before they got either hyperthermia or fake sham hyperthermia. And the results are really interesting. Red is the active, green is the sham. We don't know why people spent more time alone after getting a sham treatment. Maybe they were sort of disappointed. But look at this. There's a big, big drop. People spent much less time alone after a single treatment. Now, we only did it at week 1 and week 4. I wish we knew what week 2 was. How long does that last? See, it's not like the antidepressant response, right? People go back to their old ways. They still feel better, but they drift back to their old behavioral strategies. and they spend a lot more time. The down here is more time talking to other people. So they become much more social. And interestingly, something we noticed in the box is when people are being cooked to death, or so it seems, they become amazingly verbal, especially if there's somebody. We always have somebody in the room with them. Oh my God, blah, blah, blah. When my team does it, they'll only let certain people in the room with them because they don't want, because people become very disclosing, and seriously, and sometimes in depressed people, they'll talk the first time about abuse or things that happened to them. So we found that just listening to them out in the regular world, we're just underpowered here. Basically, they spent more time with groups of people, and they spent more time being open and honest about themselves. So it tells you, and again, why sweat lodges? Because it opens up a pro-social pathway that runs from the skin to the brain. There's probably a maximal stimulation of a pleasant pathway that it evolved, so we could all kind of lay next to each other, So, pretty interesting. Now, you wouldn't think of doing this if you thought everything was up in the brain, right? If you didn't have this idea that these sensory pathways could be accessed in these ways. Now, what about the world? So let me go back again to my buddy John Spivey, who had that beautiful quote about the landscape. While we were carrying on this massive exchange of emails, he finished a book that I find very moving called The Crying Dance, which is about the Native American world of the San Joaquin Valley. Now, the San Joaquin Valley, as far as I knew, there are these yokas, but nothing really, right? It's because they all died in 1832 from a massive plague, and the rest of them actually had bounties on their heads in the 1850s. They were all wiped out by the 1870s, 1880s, when white folks came in. But in fact, there was this astounding culture that I knew almost nothing about until the last year. In all respect to Dane County, it actually had the highest per capita of burial mounds anywhere in the world. The place was full of burial mounds. It's just that they threw them all away and flattened them, turned them into fields, right? Who knew, right? So, and in fact, here's a spot not far from where I grew up that I used to ride my bike to as a kid. This turns out to be where they would launch these massive 50-foot Thule rafts and float down this river through this sort of paradisiacal realm of wolves and grizzly bears and billions of birds down to this massive lake. In fact, the largest lake west of the Great Lakes existed in this valley. It was like the Serengeti of America. It's a beautiful vacation spot today. Here's the shoreline. Right. But for today's talk, what's interesting is that this part of California was also one of the world, or at least North American centers of shamanic activity. Again, who would have known, right? This is something near where I grew up. I had no idea this existed. And in one of his emails, John said the guys with the horns, or V-heads, have split heads representing shamans who've had their heads split open by the vision experience. Is that you? I want to comment on that. But this is the east side of Rocky Hill. So I became fascinated by the fact that I came from the shamanistic center world. I had McDonald's and Burger King. Who knew about this stuff, right? And so, it turns out that there's some pretty good evidence that trances, whether they're induced with psychedelics or other means, have these very specific elements all across the world that are probably a reflection of the design or the evolved design of the brain and sensory pathways. And there's these entopic phenomena. I'm not going to go into that today so much, but one of the interesting things about this argument is that very, very ancient, the first art, the art of the caves, was largely shamanistically driven, that it was largely an expression of these visions. And this, because people have wondered for years, well, why is this wonderful art buried in the middle of nowhere? As this anthropologist David Whitley says, and this is Chauvet here, the undeniable association between decorated panels and the deep, dark inner sanctums of the caves continues to be both compelling and perplexing. Why create what by any measure is fabulous art precisely where it is hardest to draw and least likely to be seen? And the answer, they suggest, and that is relevant to some of this really emerging psilocybin and psychedelic work, I think, is that when it comes to the world of trance, the context in which you do it becomes massively important, right? And that, in fact, we know from early studies of psychedelics that context, I think it was Franz Woldenweier, who's here, showed that you're much more likely to have bad experiences if you're laying in an fMRI or a PET scanner than if you're in a comfortable place, right? This recognition has led folks, and Hopkins and Roland Griffiths, who's here with his team, to really be at the forefront of this idea that set and setting are so crucial, right? That, here you can see this is where they do it. They get the nice music. They put me down on his couch, no psilocybin, but I got the music and the headset. 15 minutes, I was in tears. Very nice, very powerful, right? So this has been caught beautifully by one of the sort of theoretical leaders of the field, Robin Carhart Harris, that people are hypersensitive to environmental perturbations in a psychedelic state and in a trance state, importance of managing the environment. He suggests that, in fact, these agents may, what he calls criticality, they may induce enough randomness in the brain that the brain becomes more in sync with the randomness of the world. Right? So this raises a really interesting research question. Might long-term beneficial effects of psilocybin result, at least in part, from altering patterns of embodied, not just brain, but embodied cognition, emotions, in ways that make the individual more resonant with actual circumstances, that you actually put the brain more, and so that, in fact, although we think of these sort of trips as being these intense internal mental things, this sensitivity to environmental conditions suggests that there's this, in fact, perhaps deep opening to the sort of the embodiment of ourselves in the world. This is something that could be studied. So here's an example of how an embodied perspective, we don't know the answer to this, but it suggests interesting research questions. And then finally, let me talk a little bit and go back to the bugs. There's a lot of bad bugs in the world, and before about 120 years ago, 50% of every human born was dead by the age of 15. Right? So there's a lot of bad guys. It's a real society, but there were a lot of good guys. And when we got, it's like Tom Waits said, I'm afraid if I got rid of my devils, my angels would leave too. It's a great song. When we got rid of the bad guys, we got rid of a whole bunch of good guys that exist in the environment, that had co-evolved with us for millions of years, and that have very powerful anti-inflammatory, immunomodulatory effects. One of them I want to focus on real quickly is a saprophytic mycobacterium called M. vaccae. There's my buddy Graham Rook again. These guys, he and John Stanford discovered it out in the boonies of Uganda looking for an adjuvant. They knew there was something in the environment that was making some people respond to the BCG vaccine. But what they realized was this thing had these amazing effects. And just recently, and I don't have a slide for this, in Europe, they've completed a study showing that adding this mycobacterium to the skin in people that have end-stage pancreatic cancer with chemotherapy increases their lifespan by several hundred times. It really is astounding. Right? So this thing has got very powerful it's got a real oncology thing, but we know that it stimulates the same pathway that hyperthermia does. And therefore, if you inject it into the skin, it should also have interesting behavioral effects. I'm showing you data that are not published yet, so I don't want to show you all the details, but this is kind of a nastier experiment. I apologize, but I want to show it to you. Here's the thing. Some of the little mice just hang out in their caves, in their cages the whole time. They don't do anything. They have a cigar. They watch TV. They're fine. The other guys are put through 19 days of this chronic subordinate colony housing. And what that means is every day they're put in a new place, these little guys, and the big guy goes around and beats them up. And this happens every day, and it completely freaks them out. It's like my elementary school, You do this for 19 days, and at the end of that time, the mice look like they have post-traumatic stress disorder. They're anxious. They show depressive-type behaviors. If you look at their colons are crazy inflamed. They look like Swiss cheese, right? Just massive inflammatory response to this. What was fascinating, what Stefan Raber and Chris Lowry did, we as a sort of consortium did, is before this stressor, they gave the mice a couple of pre-treatments with either salt water or this Mycobacterium vaccae in the skin. And what they found was that the Mycobacterium vaccae had these astounding effects. So first, interestingly, the stressor profoundly changed the gut microbiota, right? It made it go from being kind of chilled out to being inflammatory and worked up. The Mycobacterium vaccae did not change that effect, but it blocked all the inflammation. So the mycobacterium changes, the gut microbiome changes, but something about the external old friend immunomodulatory bacteria tells the gut, hey, don't release all those angry pro-inflammatory cytokines, so you don't get the damage from the change in the microbiome, and that change is probably evolutionarily adaptive to help you fight infection. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. the mice that got to M. vacui tended to stand up for themselves a little bit more. So when the big old intruder mouse comes in and starts giving them hell, they go, just a little bit. You know what happens. Remember what I said, that all these social things have a fractal nature. You stand up to the bully, he may beat you up once, but then he kind of backs off a little bit, right? So the M. vacui induced a proactive coping style that we know in humans tends to be antidepressant and tends to be, especially in the modern world, quite beneficial, right? It blocked the development of all that anxiety, all that PTSD-like behavior in these mice. So think about that. It's not a vaccine, but it's like a pre-treatment that it induced this powerful resilience. Now, we're not injecting it into their head. We're injecting it into their paw. Now, we know, of course, it's impacting brain function, but the point is that these peripheral pathways become these remarkable access ways. And then, really interestingly, both the behavioral effects and the inflammatory effects were completely blocked if you got rid of a certain type of immune cell called a regulatory T cell. These are the primary sort of anti-inflammatory, don't attack the world cells in your body, right? So it tells you that the effect of this treatment was absolutely dependent on this peripheral system. And in fact, the immune system is going to emerge as a sort of a second nervous system, especially these T cells. They're another example of how we outsource and offload our cognitive abilities onto things that lie outside the brain, right? So here's an example. Now, what's interesting about the vacui is it's an example of an immune stimulus. So we're using an immune stimulus as a sort of deep brain stimulator. Vacui turns on exactly the same brain areas that hyperthermia does. We're also using it as a social stimulus. We're reintroducing people to this complex web of ancient connections that used to keep everything sort of in balance, right? And there's two big recent studies they've just done a microbiota study of a tribe in the Amazon that has never seen white folks, and their microbiota are totally different than ours. The whole tribe has very similar microbiota, but it's radically different. It's much richer, it's much less inflammatory. So we know that these old friends, these old organisms hold great promise in sort of restoring some balance. So that's the talk, and I want to leave you with an image, I think, that I hope will sort of cement this in your head about this is really what I'm trying to say today. So really, in conclusion, this is what I want you to, my opinion on consciousness. Don't overestimate the brain. And I promise you that's the only time Homer Simpson will make an appearance, I bet, in this entire symposium. A great hero of mine. Well, thank you very much. So it sounds like, per Penny the timekeeper, we maybe have time for one question. So whoever shoots their hands up first gets the shot. Yes, sir, in the back.
Great talk, and also I was curious thinking about the environment and the microbiology of the built environment that's surrounded by ecosystems. So could you think of designing buildings as well to keep a sort of probiotic ecosystem?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. I mean, this is the sort of thing that people are now thinking about. So the question is, could you design buildings that were sort of probiotics? Yes, yes, you could, and we probably should. And not just build. We've just launched this study. It's not a building study, but as an example of how we think dogs are probiotics. And so we've actually started a study where we're giving dogs to old folks and collecting stool samples to see whether or not we can enhance their health. Buildings could do it. Food could do it. There's a whole lot of things, where we can begin to sort of biologize our environment in ways. We don't want to go back to being bullied by these horrible pathogens, but we can't go on. We're not going to make it through the 21st century thinking that we can win a war with the bacterial world or the viral world. These guys have been around forever. They just laugh at us. We're like, when they got bored and wanted to get conscious, we're like stalks on top of them. They look around through our eyes. And we need to treat them better. We got to cut them in for a piece of the action, right? And so finding ways to come up with win-win scenarios, like buildings like that, where the microbes, they got to get something out of the deal too, though. That's the thing, right? We can't just blitzkrieg the microbial world. All right, well, I'm out of time. Thank you very much. I'm around. I'm going to put some of those books up here if anybody wants one at the break.